I want to kind of kick off with a question while the microphones are coming around. We've heard all day, basically, about, we've heard about problems. We've heard about if you have a problem, there's something you can slap on it, right? We've heard about you can put some innovation policy on it. You can stick an algorithm on it. You can stick a machine on it. You can put a story on it. But none of these seem, this seems kind of formulaic, like we're creating algorithms for solving problems. How do we get past that and we don't just get trapped in this kind of cycle of solutionism that's very reflexive and very easy to kind of resort to the plan in the box? How do we do that?
I think we have to find a way to put the people back in. Like Paul was saying earlier about the bridge, and if you're trying to tell a story about the bridge, you have to think about how that conditions user relationships and stuff like that. None of this makes any sense without understanding how these things are used, understood, imagined in the kind of course of people's everyday lives. And in many ways, what seems to work in one context will fail in others for reasons that are totally illegible to the companies or organizations that are trying to roll them out. It's not very much not a question of like one solution fits all, and we need to be more kind of literate to the needs of the people on the other end, whether that's us or like some other group entirely. We need to be able to know how they see the world.
How do we take something like narrative and turn it into a tool that's useful to at least shine a brighter light on these problems?
Can I take another tack? Would you
Yes,
mind?
please.
Thank you. Because actually what I was going to pick up was I think actually there's a combination. There's this notion of literacy and then Timo's work about making visible and bringing to the surface the kind of the really critical parts of the infrastructure. And I think these two things, it feels to me, are really both very important ideas, this idea of transparency and this idea of the need for a growing literacy. And for me, that's why I keep glomming on to storytelling, because it sits very nicely next to our understanding of what we mean by literacy. We mean the ability to read and write, to be able to tell our story, to be able to write our story. And so, I think actually one of the really critical pieces here is really helping people to be more literate in this digital, and I hesitate to use that word, but in this digitized world. And I don't mean an asset, I mean literally the digital realm. So for me, it's one of the reasons why I'm so motivated with the work that I do with Mozilla. Because a lot of it is about, how do we actually give really just hard skills to people to help them understand how one part of that, the web, works. And in giving them those skills, they then have an opportunity to influence how the web works. And I think that's where I feel it's always, I'm always going to come back to a very reductionist, give me the skills, let me take control, empower me to be able to do that.
Well, reductionism doesn't seem like a bad approach necessarily, because we've built these enormous infrastructures of problem solving.
Yeah, right.
We've built a lot of scaffolding around the problems,
right.
which creates a nice place to sit a piece of technology.
Yep.
So,
yeah.
Any thoughts on this question?
Well, I think one of the things that, just when you were speaking, I'm trying to get some funding for a project on the Amazon Kindle and to write up how to reveal this thing.
Right.
Has made me go to particle physics and think about dark matter, right. and kind of weighs in. James Bridle, one for the bingo cards, gave a talk recently in Malmo where he was also talking about this kind of literacy and how, how do you deal with the bins that are spying on you in London? How do you deal with, Wi-Fi sniffing? How do you make this visible, and how do you find a language and metaphors and symbols, that show there's been a spying on you, or actually maybe your Kindle is a big data surveillance device, maybe that. And so one of the ways in which I started thinking about this is sometimes, because I work a lot in this area, big data, and I'm very interested in the myth of big data. So this idea that there is a science behind the algorithm and a science behind big data, and that through this process of scientification, we shouldn't really worry about any other things, but often we can't get hold of the data. So I can't get hold of Kindle data. I can't get hold of, my own data in this process. And I have this company that is storing all this data in the cloud. They are essentially a data infrastructure company. And to wait until the day we possibly can get access to the data, that's way too late. So what I've been really struggling to think through is how can you make this data visible? And one of the ways in which I was thinking is kind of by drawing on particle physics to think about dark matter, and the way in which you make dark matter visible, as far as I understand it, is try and make visible what's around it. And so there are data traces everywhere, and these things leave traces. Patents are being granted for these things. There are ways in, and that's one of the ways I think we should, for me, that's one way in.
Georgina?
I guess I'd extend it to what, I know it's a button I keep pushing, but one thing that gets me a lot is not being able to make power structures visible, social power structures. To be able to kind of create that reflexiveness and looking in to determine with a big stick, the people who are involved in the kind of creation of these technologies or the creation of the norms around them, to recognize that they are not neuter and not abstract and not invisible. They carry weight in dynamics and projections. The nearest way I can describe it is I've taught ethics to engineering ethics as a course for a while. It's something that I absolutely love. And it feels like it's its own version of lifting up, making the reality field material to talk about it. One of the best compliments that I had about it from a student who's, at that stage had done all science A-levels and was probably on track to be an engineer somewhere, who said, all the stuff we talk about, about the gender or the racial structure of the teams that we work in, of the kind of the biases towards funding, of the kind of the values that we give on names, of the ways that we call things certain things and other things. We talk about conquests in the work that we're doing. That's the stuff we talk about in the pub, but we don't get taught about it formally. And that's kind of abstracted. That's even this idea that in STEAM of science, technology, engineering, and then arts and humanities as well, the kind of the social science gets lost there. And I know, again, this is entirely self-serving, but I would want to bring that back up because the sociology of science and technology is awesome, but it's a light, it shines it, and that I would push more of that.
More to add, or just gesture?
I had just one final thought, which is the problem is that we go out and we make these structures visible, and then they're visible, and they're huge and terrifying. Do any of you have any thoughts about what happens then? I guess I'm feeling what Tobias was saying earlier, where it's like, Occupy has seen this kind of large
Yeah. I mean, there's kind of all the other thing of, you show up the structure and the person at the top of the structure goes, yeah.
Hello.
That's my castle, there
me.
you go, I don't know, that's the bit where I trip up quite badly.
Well, this is kind of the question that's come up. We're talking about visibility, and that's kind of why I opened the can of transparency at the beginning of the session. We talk a lot about invisibility and visibility, detecting seams, et cetera. The work that Timo and his group has done has kind of given us an illustration of that. But one word that's come up in almost every talk today is agency. And the hidden word behind that is access. It's one thing to show everyone this kind of, large dragon, this big monster, but how do we then simultaneously create access that gives agency to people to do something about that big thing that's just been revealed?
And I think partly in that is the assumption that that people care about the big thing being revealed. And that frightens me, that, these revelations come out and people go, so, not my problem, I'm going to the shops now. So this is thinking through this kind of thing with Amazon and algorithms, the thing that is possibly more worrying is people just not necessarily caring about this. So you can kind of talk about how do you kind of bring them to agency, which I think is a problematic way of positioning it in a way. It's kind of, there are these people out there waiting to be emancipated, I mean, I have a problem with that framework. But I guess the question is, how do you get beyond the not caring? Because I think we care, but this is a small room and we're fairly representative, I think.
Yeah, I think this is actually one of the biggest issues that we face is, as a friend of mine described it as apathy, and I really pushed back on that. And I was like, I don't know that it is apathy. I think that the challenge that we have is we have a public who doesn't have another alternative that helps them actually expend the energy necessary to engage. And, you know, I think about this particularly in the context of London and the kind of observation state that we live in. And for many people, it makes no difference to them if the cameras are there or not. There is no difference to their day. And so we aren't able to articulate a clear enough alternative about the difference it actually is making and the difference it actually has made. Because to them, at a personal level, they're finding it really hard. You know, I mean, one of my pet topics is, you know, we're in danger of losing our entire cultural heritage of the 20th century. And because it's locked up in copyright and it probably will be for the foreseeable future. And we have a whole generation for whom that means absolutely nothing because they don't know what they don't have. And it doesn't occur to them to even go and ask for, hey, can I have my cultural heritage from the 20th century? And again, it's because we're not actually, I think, good enough at articulating the alternatives. Here are the alternatives, which is why I think, you know, discussions around improving reality are so important. It's the beginning of that kind of ability to discuss, here is the other.
There's also something, just thinking about this, in terms of the difference between visibility and impact. And this is just a quick thing, but as I understand it, one of the things that's been really difficult for people who've been working around the climate change debate to kind of make their case is it's invisible. It has long-term impacts that are kind of creeping slowly. You know, it's very hard to, you know, in daily life to kind of feel that thing. So you've got this very kind of ambiguous sense of there is this might be this bad thing out there, but on a day-to-day basis, it's kind of not there. So there's not that kind of actual push. That kind of, it's not even seeing. You can lock out billboards that you walk to work past. You kind of, you know, you see your living room or you see your duvet cover every day, and it's not something that kind of carries this, you know, this rich and textured meaning, but it's kind of getting that understanding through push. And unfortunately, those who are going to be on the hard edge of it may likely be those with, you know, the least control or ability to deal with it as well. There's also something about the framing of it as well. You know, again, coming back to kind of visibility and literacy, that communication is not understanding. It's not just enough to kind of put this in the world and say, look, there it is. It's kind of, the standard example is, you know, you can give a copy of a paper from, probably not from Nature or Science, but from one of the leading cell biology journals to everyone in this room. You know, we can link to it on Twitter, and unless we've got any cell biologists in the room, it doesn't mean we understand it at all. Just availability and visibility is not enough. There's also this kind of this added layer of understanding that comes with it, but that's not necessarily the same as ability as well.
Do we have any questions? Surely we must. Out in the audience, lots of hands. If we can get a microphone to, where's the nearest microphone? Gentleman in second row.
Good afternoon. Thank you for the excellent talks. Talking about visibility throughout the day, I'm just interested to know that sort of like two of the superstructures and networks that have governed society for the last God knows how 1,000 years are crime and religion, which we haven't talked about a lot today, which I'm just interested in if there's any comments on that. And secondly, Paula, you mentioned sort of the Notting Hill riots, which is kind of interesting when you compare it to, say, the impact of what's happening with Occupy in England, because regardless of what anybody says, the riots in the 80s in London had a massive impact in terms of making things visible for certain groups, and I would happily argue positively as well. So we're talking about visibility, and you were talking about morality and apathy just now. I was interested that nobody's really, again, talked about making these things visible in the age-old ways of you would have had in 60s counterculture through things like revolution. Literally, nobody's talking about that now. It's like, well, if I get enough of a group together and I get enough likes, we'll get them to change their way. What's happened to old school revolution?
In an interest of time, let's take the second question because I think we can probably pick up crime and religion in the pub afterwards. I think there's probably a promise that's being made. So on his last questions, if you have any thoughts.
Revolution. I'm really fond of that word, I have to say. It's unusual for me not... Yeah, no, and it's unusual for me not to use that. I think it's a measure of my own mild depression, actually, that it's not. So I think some of my own disillusionment, if you like, is that we've seen expressions of revolution in really profound and interesting ways over the last couple of years. The Arab Spring, I think, was an extraordinary expression of revolution. I think our own more recent riots are a profoundly important moment in terms of a revolutionary impulse, perhaps not realised, but an impulse. My fear around this is that we seem to have a growing disconnect between the kind of political apparatus for change and the public expression of a desire for change. And I'm not a political scientist by any stretch of the imagination, and I don't say that proudly. I wish I was actually much more informed about sort of political science and political theory. But even in my sort of very immature take on it, it feels like we do have a revolutionary set of tools. And, for me, it feels a lot like the first pamphleteers. Lest we forget the impact that actually the ability to mass publish and distribute ideas had at a particular point in history, we have something that I think is on a scale far more profound. And the fear is that I think we keep abstracting away from the power of that technology. And I think that's why, I'm sure many of you are able to be much more articulate about your reservations with Facebook. For me, the reservation is it just feels like I'm getting abstracted away from the real power of that tool set. Right.
One Tim agrees.
So, and I think that's the challenge. So, if there's a place for revolution, it is in this room, just as it was with the pamphleteers. It is about shining a light on the power of those tools and the capacity they have to empower people to have a voice. And I think the piece that I was trying very badly to say earlier is that for the first time we have the ability to have the community of voices, that mass, sort of sheer numbers, and we have the opportunity to drill down to every single individual story. And that is something that we have never had in the past, and that's the thing that increasingly I am starting to think is the difference that will impact on that political apparatus. I don't know. But that's where I think the revolution is.
Can we sneak in one more question? Just, I want to make sure that we get a couple from the floor, and then we'll pick those up.
Hi, I loved all of your talks. You asked the question, what is the alternative? And it was interesting that in all of the talks almost, you were looking at closed technologies, whether it's Facebook or Google Loon, etc. And it's clear to me at least that the alternative is open technologies, but possibly not in the state that they are today. And I think you all touched upon those as well, about access, about how something could be open but not accessible to people. So I think that's kind of what's important here in terms of providing an alternative, in terms of tools, not just shining a light, which is very important, of course, but then to save the kind of depression that you're in, Paula, to actually have an alternative. Well, what are your thoughts along that, on open technologies? Because I didn't really hear about that in your talks.
I'd love to hear everyone else, because I'm well known, and you can go see my stuff around open, so.
I kind of oscillate wildly between being massively optimistic and massively pessimistic, and slowly kind of trying to emerge at some more stable middle state. I think that open isn't enough, like you say, as it is now, and there are a lot of problems around the way it is currently configured. I also think I like the kind of stuff I was talking about around fluid technology. I think is really interesting and kind of useful in if you want something to be able to kind of go out and succeed on its own terms. It has to be able to adapt to various situations. But I think there's also questions around authorship and ownership. I mean, I'm a intellectual property abolitionist, probably, in terms of the way it stands. But who's to say that something isn't going to take what you did and use it for undesirable or exploitative ends, or adapt it in some way that you wouldn't approve of, or so you release this thing out into the world and then it kind of comes back changed in some way. There's all kinds of questions around that. I think that this kind of idea of kind of being able to impart literacy, being able to teach people how to use it, and how to kind of sustain these systems over the longer term is really important. And that it's not enough to just kind of drop an open technology or the blueprints for something into an environment and expect it to succeed on its own behalf. So that's kind of where I stand.
If you have the Smith's bingo card, oscillate wildly, you can mark that one on there.
Yeah, just very briefly, I sort of what Justin said, but partly one of the things for me with open is I kind of keep thinking about the violence that is often associated with open, that's quite hidden, but is really there. It's also particular structures that are organized and maintained in certain ways that I cannot get particularly enthusiastic about, and they're not particularly inclusive. And I think we don't talk enough about the potentially unintended consequences when we share this openness and think that there is some sort of international possibility, universal possibility of some of these techniques or some of these platforms or some of these mechanisms that may have absolutely disastrous consequences outside of the realm where they were created. For example, issues around land. I'm doing a fairly humble, I would say, not particularly threatening project on open data and allotments, but the thing that scares me is kind of open standards for land, opening up land data on a mass scale. What does that do in the developing world? Who has access to, then gaining access to that land? Who understands, who has the literacy to understand that the land has been, the rug has been pulled from underneath them. So I'm much more pessimistic about open. I think open is a myth that needs to be cracked open.
And I'd broadly follow with that. Open makes me nervous. Kind of following on from the comments, it's not the dynamics, both in terms of hardware, software, other systems, the social dynamics of those who are kind of pulling it together are not necessarily representative or kind of, open or inclusive. The consequence, what makes me, I think from my own experience, what makes me nervous is seeing it turn into another buzzword, like innovation, something that gets picked up as the next best thing. This is something I've seen creeping in around the kind of the academic open innovation community and the industry open innovation community. That's something that started with software and other practices and a quite strong political kind of hacker ethos has now been picked up, again, sitting in power structures because, the power structures are everywhere, where the openness is seen as a way of kind of opening up forms of R&D within companies to try and bring in communities or other patterns, but not necessarily in a way that's monetized or that compensates those who are involved with it as well. But because it's open, jazz hands, then that feels like that's enough. Not pushing to kind of deconstruct everything, but I feel that it's important to be very, very careful about what is meant by openness and who is wielding that term itself.
I'm really conscious we need to close down, but Paula's asked for one last word, so.
Yeah, sorry, because I completely am pro-open, so I just felt like that.
Open sofa, closed sofa.
So
questioning,
building a
taking control, seeing, building, experimenting, all these sort of themes have come up. So we're going to take that last kind of open-closed rumble to drinks afterwards. Honor's going to have a final word, but thank you very much, and please thank the panel. They did a fantastic job.